Hi, I'm Dr. Teena Cahill, and welcome to Wisdom and Beyond. Today we have two great guests with us. One I've known for a little bit, for a few decades at least, have known about you. Dr. William Hayes, who's an adolescent and child psychologist and president of the National Alliance for Mental Illness here in Mercer County. Is that right?
That's right, Teena.
That's great. And with you today is Sally Osmer. Is that how I say it, Sally?
That's right. Osmer, yes.
Osmer, who is the executive director of the National Alliance for Mental Illness for Mercer County.
That's right.
Well, it's great for you guys to be here. I'm so happy you're here. And
Thanks.
you belong. This organization is one that's always been pretty close to my heart. But I would like for you to tell me, what does that mean, the National Alliance for Mental Illness? What is that?
Well, it's a family, and the term that NAMI uses is mental health consumer. So it's for people who are living with mental illness and for families. And we're dedicated to improving the lives of all people who are affected by mental illness by providing education, support, and advocacy.
And do you have chapters in every county? Is Mercer County one of?
Mercer County is one of several in this state,
Okay.
and it's a national organization, and we're represented in almost every state.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. How did it start? Who started it?
Well, from what I understand, it was a group of mothers.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Leave it to the
Mothers,
moms, right?
caregivers,
Yeah.
and a group of 5 or 6 women clustered in different areas of California, and then they began springing up all over the country. But in general, they came together to say, it's not our fault that our children have mental illness, and we're not going to take it anymore.
That's right.
And we want better science and better care for our children. And it became an alliance. And so the image of the organization really has continued to carry that alliance of people banded together because they have this common concern, whether they're living with mental illness themselves or whether they're providers who are caring for people with mental illness or family members.
And as I have said to you, when I was a young woman back in the 70s and early 80s in graduate school, I actually grew up in a situation where my grandmother died in a psychiatric hospital. She was a college graduate. She was a nurse. She had been socially active in World War I. And I saw what not understanding that did to her family, to her children particularly, not having an understanding of what was wrong or what it meant or the stigma that goes along with that. So I made a choice during my graduate years for my dissertation in clinical psychology to do a program where I taught caregivers about psychiatric issues. I taught about caregiving. I taught about behavior modification. I taught whatever I thought would be a decent curriculum. And I'm happy to say that there's been a whole bunch of piggyback research on that where I went to graduate school because I wanted to see, and I think NAMI started, did NAMI start in the 70s?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, about the same time. I think there started to be an awareness of, look, we have enough science now that maybe we better understand this is nobody's fault. There's science to this, and certainly you come from a place where you understand there's science to this. How do you understand psychiatric disorders?
Well, I think the underlying cause for many of the psychiatric illnesses is a brain-based biological disorder.
Right.
And it really is a shame that people don't understand that. And it's related to the fact that we're intimately connected to our brains like we are not to any other organ. You can have a heart transplant, but you can't have a brain transplant.
We are our brains.
We are.
To a large extent. That's right. And so now we know that for anything that goes on in life, whether it includes some kind of psychopathology or whether it's to some extent how we behave in many ways, it's a combination of our biology, perhaps the coping strategies that we've learned, the environment, perhaps toxins. Who knows what's part of all of this? I mean, isn't that how NAMI would look at psychiatric disorders at this time?
Yes, and in fact, a major way that we would endorse this kind of multi-perspective approach is in terms of understanding treatments.
Yes.
And that everybody's different, and that there are a whole range of wellness and recovery strategies that one needs to try. And we do believe in medication and in physicians and in the interventions of modern science, and Dr. Hayes will support that. But we believe in good nutrition and friendships.
Connectedness.
Connectedness.
I like to say the wider and tighter our webs of connectedness, the higher we bounce.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, Teena, because I remember when I first started to work with psychiatric patients in an inpatient setting, I was amazed at the number of people I talked to had so severe psychosocial stresses.
Yes,
Their
that's
families, they really didn't have supports, and you would hear their stories, and you were amazed at the amount of trauma they went through. And it became clear to me that it was, in great part, their lack of social supports that ended up with them being unable to deal with their illness.
That's
and there are
right.
some illnesses that biologically you'll get so ill that you might need to be in a hospital. But often it's not the illness per se, it's the difficulty you're having dealing with your interpersonal relationships, or
Right.
the lack of support in your community, being out of work, all things that are not necessarily your fault.
Right, and also if you're a caregiver of someone who has a psychiatric disorder, the worst thing for any of us in the best of times is isolation. And so when we're having difficulties, when we're having challenges, it's just exponentially increased. And so I'm sure that's why those mothers came together, because they had a common thing that they could talk about, and they were supporting one another. And I like to say that we started out as nomads, and then we formed tribes, and then we had villages, and there was this connectedness that went on. One person's contribution was another one's support, and it was just how the village worked. And now the civilization has gotten so big, we live in these boxes that we call houses, and then we develop this sort of pecking order in life in our cultures, and then there's this stigma, and the next thing you know, people are isolated, and it's just never good. And I agree with your mission, and that is that education is how we teach people, first of all, the etiology of situations, but also how we can manage them. And you told me before that you have several educational programs that are out there. Let's hear about some.
We, as an affiliate of the national organization, carry out their signature programs. And primary in that is a program called Family to Family,
Okay.
which is taught by family members of an adult with serious mental illness. And we usually have the courses every fall and every spring. They're 12 weeks, one evening a week. So it's an intense commitment, and it goes over all of the major mental illnesses,
Right.
treatments, recovery, coping strategies for families, caregiving strategies, as well as kind of ending on an upbeat note of how can you become an advocate not only for your own loved one, but for the whole mental health system, so that we can improve it together.
Well, first of all, we're going to have parity very soon, which means I think starting in 2010, right?
Right.
Insurance companies are going to be required to pay for the medications that we need for mental illnesses the same way that their policy pays for other ones. But what else can people do to advocate?
Right.
What's another way?
Well, there are many ways that NAMI helps to educate people about ways that we can improve our system. In New Jersey, we recently had a bill passed for involuntary outpatient commitment, which basically means that a person may be court-ordered to receive some form of treatment so that his or her life can improve.
Right.
And so that if a person won't have to be hospitalized in order to receive treatment involuntarily.
And Bill, do you want to talk a little bit about why we would want a law like that? What goes on with someone when they have a serious psychiatric disorder?
Well, I'd say that the biggest reason that we'd want to think about involuntary outpatient commitment are families who have a son or daughter or loved one that has a psychiatric illness in which their ability to understand what's really going on is
Right.
impaired. They become psychotic. They become delusional, paranoid. They think everyone is out to get them. They might think that all their food is poisoned,
Right.
and will act to protect themselves for dangers that really aren't there. And the families will go to emergency rooms attempting to get help. But if the person who's there pulls themselves together and says, "Oh, well, no, I'm
right.
okay. I won't harm anybody," right now the staff in hospitals really don't have the legal ability to enforce treatment. And it's a very sensitive issue.
That's right.
We have just as many advocates
I know.
with psychiatric illnesses who say, well, you can't force treatment on those
That's right.
who don't want it. But the nice thing about the outpatient commitment law that they're trying to establish is that you will be ordered to be continued to be monitored.
Yes.
And it's up to you how much treatment you do participate with, but a judge is now going to sit with you again in 5 or 6 weeks and reevaluate whether you're continuing to be potentially dangerous to yourself. So it really gives families a way to try and help ensure that their loved ones get treatment, because you don't want to be in a circumstance where you find out that your child who is away at college really needed treatment,
Right.
isn't getting treatment, and you find out they've harmed themselves.
And this is the thing that I've heard families years ago when what I did, the program I did in graduate school was a 6-part program that I did for the people in NAMI. And that was the thing that parents would say all the time, and that is, there's no power greater than me and I have no power. And so what you're saying is, and I will often say to people not to be afraid of the justice system, because sometimes it actually can be there to protect us and to take care of us and to try to help our loved ones get the support that they need.
Yes, yes.
It's another area of advocacy that we're working on in Mercer County. We're trying to make sure that the police officers in the county really have a really excellent understanding of mental
that's great.
illness, and when they intervene with somebody who has a psychiatric disorder, that they realize that they should be taking them to the screening center
That's
to
right.
get treatment instead of being brought to jail.
Right, I don't think that's I think that sometimes that's so convoluted that I'm sure that if you're a law enforcement person and you're there, it's hard to understand what is a psychiatric disorder and what just looks like unlawful activity. I mean, that's a great training to do.
What's
Not that
wonderful-
we can all get it right all the
Yeah,
time
well,
either.
it is wonderful, and I work with so many parents who they're so afraid to call the police
Of
when they're in
course,
trouble.
absolutely.
And I let them know that, I mean, my experience is that most of the police officers
Right.
end up being junior therapists.
Oh,
They
that's
really want to
great.
try and help the kids.
right.
They're not there to, physically restrain them. And they
right.
usually try and convince the kids that, hey, you ought to work with your parents, and
Right.
if you need to participate with therapy, to do that.
I speak a lot in law enforcement venues, and one of the terms I like to use that I think helps the public understand law enforcement a little bit better is to remind them that these are public safety officers.
Peace officer.
They're
Yes,
public safety,
right.
peace. They're out there to protect the public and to protect the individuals within that. What else do you guys have? What else does NAMI have?
I wanted to mention our other major education program, and that's NAMI Basics. And that is a program that's only been developed in the last few years, but it's had rave reviews. We've had it for 2 years. And it's for parents or caregivers of children 18 and younger.
Okay.
It's a 6 weeks class, and it goes over all major behavioral and brain disorders that children might have, and coping strategies, and ways of dealing with schools and
Yes.
dealing with problem behaviors. And a very important part of the class is learning to take care of yourself as a caregiver.
Sure.
And
Well, my line is we can't take care of anyone else if we don't take care of ourselves first, right?
exactly. And it's very important for us to point out that all of our programs are free.
That's great.
We are not a treatment organization. We're an alliance, a membership organization, and we believe that people are already paying enough
Right.
through the varieties of treatments
That's right.
that their family members need. And we want to make this available for the public.
And I think that's what people don't really understand unless they're in that situation. If you have a loved one that requires special needs, I think particularly a child, one of the things that interests me is I work with caregivers who, by the way, I believe are the greatest leaders on earth, because if you look at the research on leadership, leaders listen with sort of that third ear, to what's said, what's not said, changes in behavior, all that kinds of things. And they handle all kinds of weird problems, and they help to try to enhance the potential of people around them. So who does that better than a caregiver, right? And what happens in the caregiving field, I find a lot, is that caregiving gets co-opted a little bit by people who are caring for mom and dad, or perhaps people who are caring for a loved one with maybe one of the memory disorders, with dementia, because those are long-lasting care situations. But what doesn't get talked about is the parent who cares for the child. That's a lifetime of caregiving, right? And I think that I'm an advisor for a school for parents for autism. And that's another example of these parents who spend their life caring for the child, but they sort of get lost in the caregiving field. They don't get talked about the way someone gets talked about when they have a loved one with dementia. But you're a child and adolescent psychiatrist. Now, we've got great new treatments for children. We have whole new ways of of looking at some of the issues that go on for kids. We never used to think a child could have bipolar disorder, right?
It's true.
That's true, and that was a big controversy when that thing started.
It-
for the whole
it-
idea.
It's still a major
I know it
controversy,
is.
Teena, and I'd be more than happy to talk about that.
Well, go ahead.
Well, I think the people at Harvard who presented that data did a fabulous job of educating psychiatrists around the country that bipolar disorder can exist in childhood. But they've also raised the alternative that childhood bipolar disorder could be a different syndrome. So they've been proposing that children who are very irritable and explosive and have temper tantrums throughout the day, that this may be a variant of bipolar disorder in childhood, and it's tremendously controversial. And I trained at Georgetown. One of my colleagues, Ellen Liebenluft, is in charge of the research unit at the National Institutes of Health. And the National Institutes of Health has taken a very rigid position that childhood bipolar disorder is the way it looks in adulthood. And this other syndrome, we're not really sure what it is. And I'll tell you, many of the patients that I see are children with very severe ADHD that really hasn't been optimally treated. And then other children, they don't really look like, they don't have the classic symptoms of manic depressive illness. At the National Institutes of Health, they've had a whole population of children who they feel would have been diagnosed as bipolar disorder in other settings. They actually called them multidimensionally impaired because they were impaired socially with mood disorders, sometimes psychotic. These are children who they tried to evaluate in their schizophrenia program, but they really weren't schizophrenic, though they had some psychotic symptoms. They followed these kids for a decade, and they found out that when they go into early adolescence, they end up having depressive disorders and not bipolar illness. So it's still not quite clear, so I'm very cautious.
Well, I think you need to be very cautious. I'm not suggesting that you don't need to be. I think you do. But my point here is, what's a family to do? I mean, that's the issue. There, especially when you're dealing with the childhood disorders, where there is no, and it's actually true with adults too. Quite often, these are individual situations. You can't take science and apply it to every single individual uniformly. There was recently an article in Newsweek that was written about cognitive behavioral psychology, and I'm a cognitive behavioralist, sort of saying that most cognitive behaviorists don't really apply the science as it is found in the science. Well, yeah, I mean, everybody's an individual, so I would like, we're not lab rats. That's just the issue. And that issue is, again, even more so when we're trying to look at psychiatric disorders that are much more significant. And you've just touched on that, and I think this leads families, you hear them all the time, we've all heard them all the time. Who do I listen to? Who do I believe? One person says that, another person says that, and it's my guess that this organization brings together all the different theoretical models or all the different hypotheses to help families make a choice. Is that right? Do you do that?
It is, and I think one of the things that's tremendously helpful about NAMI is that it's made up of parents who are volunteers who either themselves have had psychiatric illness or have families that they're struggling with, and they run this organization. Our board members are filled with either parents of children with rather serious psychiatric diagnoses or individuals who've had serious depressive disorders themselves. And so these are the people you want to talk to. So you say, where does a parent go? I'll tell you, in Mercer County, they can come to NAMI Mercer and they're going to get the information.
Great.
And they'll be told about their illnesses. They'll be told about, well, how do you work with a psychiatrist?
Great.
How do you find one?
That's right.
How do you handle it
That's
when
right.
your insurance isn't really
That's
covering
right.
someone? And where else do you get the other supports you need? How do you work with your school systems? How do you work with housing? All these issues that are tremendously important. And they can get support at NAMI by talking, number one, through parents who've been through it.
I can't
And are
imagine a
living
better
it.
resource. I can't imagine a better resource.
We have a weekday helpline, and it's pretty distinct from many of the helplines or warm lines or hotlines that are out there, and because it's not anonymous. So if I answer the phone, I'll say, hi, my name is Sally, how can I help you? And someone might go into their story, of course, and say, this is happening with my loved one. And I would immediately, as any of our helpline workers would say, well, this is what worked with my family.
Yes.
And we can send you some resources, but we understand that this has been a long road for you, and so it's very healing, I think, for people to know that they're not alone.
That's right.
In this struggle. And we often, in particular, with the case of people with younger children and people who have loved ones in their early 20s, so they're new to a diagnosis, we will often get the helpline caller's name and number, which we always do, but we will connect them with a family who's been through a similar circumstance.
That's great.
And as we started the program, we can say that everyone's unique, but also in people are not totally unique. There is overlap with experience, and it's important for people to know that there are other people who've experienced similar circumstances, and that they have survived and thrived and coped and kept their family together.
And that life goes on. And the thing
yeah.
I would say is, find me a family where we don't have these kinds of issues. I mean, come on. Every family has something, and if we either have psychiatric issues, or lots of times we have a dual diagnosis where people have tried to self-medicate with alcohol, right? And once you remove the alcohol, you see the underlying issue. So this whole idea that we need to be alone, or that we are alone, is something that we all grew up with because nobody talked about things and we put walls around it. So to break those walls down and to have real human beings saying, listen, I understand what it's like to see what's going on, or I've been through this. I can't imagine anything that's better for families. And if mom and dad are doing better, the people in the family are going to do better. I think you would agree with that.
Oh, I do, and I know you have a Nurturing the Nurturer program.
I do.
And I think that part of what I do is I'm always telling parents who come to me with a child who's in serious trouble, I say, you need to start dating each other. And they're like,
yes,
what?
absolutely.
I said, well, no, you
So
need to go
true.
take care of yourselves, or you're not
That's
going to have the
right.
emotional energy to
Yeah.
support your child. So that's tremendously important for caregivers.
Well, I have to tell you that, first of all, when you get a diagnosis or when you first realize your child has a problem, you know, when my husband had his cerebral hemorrhage in the middle of the night, I used to teach psychophysiology. Come on, I knew we were in serious trouble, and I was lost. I mean, what do you do when this is happening in your own bedroom, you know, in your own bed? It's a little bit different than when you're working in a hospital or you're, you know, doing these kinds of things. So I really felt that whole sort of, what do I do now? What do I do besides calling for help? Well, what happened is, and you guys don't know this, but the way I started speaking all over the world, and my book is on caregiving, and the way I started the radio show and all that kind of stuff was, it took me about 10 years to get my husband stabilized because he continues to have multiple disabilities or multiple challenges. And we had 6 kids between us, and they needed to get educated and all those kinds of things. And I have wonderful friends and a wonderful family, but about, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago, I was sitting over here at the house, and it was the anniversary of all of this starting, and I was feeling sad. And I said to myself, Teena, why are you feeling sad? You have this great life, great children, great friends, great this. He's, you know, when you're given no chance to live, every day you live, you've really exceeded the prognosis.
Yeah.
You know, you've gotten way better. But I realized that what it was I wasn't sorry for my husband or the children. I wasn't even sorry. I was missing me. Because as a caregiver, and even though I took care of myself maybe better than some people, I had used my energy to try to stabilize my husband, stabilize the family, but I knew that I had to go forward in a way that was about me, that was something I wanted to do, so that I had something that was mine in addition to being there as a supportive caregiver.
Yes.
And that's really how I started doing this. And also, you know, you guys both know this, that when you have a disability or your child has a disability or your loved one, whether it's psychiatric or not or whatever, your social situations change. And so it's really important for caregivers, I believe, in any situation, to figure out what they love to do and go do more of it and get the kind of help that they need so they can go do more of that and have a piece of their life just for them, because that's the energy that helps us go forward. And there are places, now do you have anything about respite care do you get into respite care at all?
We do not have respite care. That is actually in our particular area, it's a great need.
Yes.
And we don't provide that, nor is there a real organization in our particular county that does.
Well, I just did a radio show this morning with a woman in Middlesex County. There's something called the Interfaith Network of Care, and they do provide like 2 hours at a time kind of respite care in certain situations. I think that'd be a great thing for NAMI to do, to try to get something going so that there could be some trained respite care for people.
I think that from my understanding and a little bit of experience trying to work for our own family is that oftentimes there will be respite care developed for seniors and for people with developmental disabilities, but the mental health piece has not, the training for the particular kinds of circumstances that families might run into has not been structured.
I agree, and don't you think that's just a little bit more of this sort of fear of that it hasn't really been structured because it's still, people are still fearful and they don't exactly know what to do. What do you think?
I think it's still got to do with the illness and the lack of education about psychiatric disorders and the stigma that's involved.
Yes.
And we do provide some kind of respite because we offer group programming for children who have serious psychiatric problems. So there's a group
social group
for these kids, and then the parents get to have some time away while their child's in that group, and often they get a support group as part of that. So it's not the kind of respite that you've just described. And it is true that the developmental disability community has done a very good job of making sure that's available for them, and they've gotten a lot of political support, and we still need to do a lot of work getting the political support to make sure that happens.
And so NAMI has this advocacy part to it, right? So if someone wants to help advocate politically. Well, I think that what you guys are doing is great, and I think also that your idea of date night is wonderful, that mom and dad or aunt and uncle or grandma and grandpa, whomever the caregivers might be, that you have to really take care of one another to go forward, to provide the platform that you need for the children. But I also think that we really have to all work toward education and reducing stigma of any of the things that exist in our society, because it's isolating for the people that are dealing with it, and ultimately it's isolating for society too. Society stays a little bit ignorant and doesn't really understand. And I also think we need to make it clear that having a psychiatric disorder does not mean you won't function in life, does not mean you can't be successful, right? Let's talk about that for 1 second.
Well, one wonderful thing about our organization is about 20 years ago, some parents and siblings of people with mental illness formed a group called Just Friends. And it's still going, and they're getting older. So we have about 50 people in Just Friends, and we've started a younger group called Becoming Friends for 20-somethings, and then we have the Just Kids program for kids under 18. And it's totally peer run.
Isn't that great?
So they can have friendships, and about half of the group is working full time.
That's great.
And the other half has some struggles, but is able to experience social life. They have over 100 events a year.
That's great.
So they have more social life than most adults in our community. I
and
think.
You would agree with me that this has nothing to do with intelligence. It's just a biological issue with some other things going on with it too.
I think it's no different than hypertension.
That's what I think. I agree.
It's just an illness that you can get. And what's really interesting is that the interventions for hypertension are stress management. If you see your doctor and he says you have high blood pressure, before he gives you a pill, he's going to say practice stress management, get healthier, lose weight, change your diet, exercise more. And actually that's part of the wellness intervention that we work with people with at NAMI all the time, and I try and work on it in my practice. But I think the other thing that we do is education. We have an In Our Own Voice program where people with serious psychiatric illnesses will get out and say, hi, I'm John, I have schizophrenia. And people are like, well, but you look normal. Say, well, yes, I am normal. I just happen to have schizophrenia.
That's exactly right.
And we have an Educate the Educator program where we go out to schools to talk with them, which is very important to make sure the teachers understand this, because I still, and I'm sure you have in your practice, see people, they've been depressed for a decade and never knew that they had an illness, and it's just So
And my line
disheartening.
is, everybody has something. We all have something, you know, and if you're going to have an ulcer, you're going to treat the ulcer, right? And we have to go back to Hans Selye. I bet you remember Hans Selye. Well, I'm older, so you probably don't remember Hans Selye. But in 1937, he had this great book called Stress Without Distress. You're going to have stress. I'm going to have stress. Everybody's going to have stress. The trick in life is to learn how to manage it so that we can learn to have stress without distress. And when we do that, it helps us no matter what we've got, right? Well, thank you very much. So we have William Hayes. Bill is an adolescent and child psychiatrist here in Princeton, who's the president of the NAMI Mercer chapter, and Sally Osmer, who's a social worker, by the way, and who's the executive director of the National Alliance on Mental Illness for Mercer County. Thank you, guys. I love
Thank
your work.
you.
Will you come back?
I will.
Oh, well, I love it. And thanks to each of you for being here with us today. I hope you've learned something. You can teach us something. Have a great time, and we'll see you at the next show. Bye-bye.